Hello, everybody. A few days ago, we did a show with Irene Carmon, a distinguished journalist, on her new book, Unbearable: 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America. Carmon suggested that the American government is encouraging what she called a policy of eugenicism, and perhaps even worse when it comes to who chooses to have babies or who can have babies and who can't. We've covered the eugenics movement in other shows as well. We did a show a couple of years ago with Eric Peterson, who the author of The Shortest History of Eugenics, From Science to Atrocity: How a Dangerous Movement Shaped the World and Why It Persists. It's a history of eugenics both in the United States and in Nazi Germany. And he suggested that the Nazis really made eugenics unacceptable. And we're back to the same subject today, but more specifically, in a new book called The Devil's Castle: Nazi Eugenics, Euthanasia, and How Psychiatry's Troubled History Reverberates Today, with my guest, Susanne Antonetta, a distinguished writer, talking to us from Asheville, North Carolina, where she lives. Perhaps, Susanne, we might begin with a definition of what eugenics actually means.
Absolutely. Eugenics is a movement that started in 1883. The term was coined by a cousin of Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, and we now understand it to mean good genes, eugenics. Eu means good. At the time, they didn't really know what a gene was, but it was based on the idea that what they called at the time germplasm, or just the hereditary material you inherit, kind of controls who you are, what you do, whether you make good or bad decisions in life, and trumps everything else. So it's really a belief that we should try guiding human development by guiding human reproduction to get more of what was labeled better genes, which history teaches us rarely are better genes.
Yeah, as I said, and I'm sure you're familiar with Peterson's book, The Shortest History of Eugenics. It's a good book, and it was a good conversation.
Excellent.
He suggests that a lot of the intellectual ferment for eugenics in the 19th century came from the United States, and then it hit a wall, quite understandably, after the Nazi experiments with eugenics. Is that a fair analysis of the history of eugenics in the United States?
Yes, I think it is a very fair analysis. One historian put it as eugenics died in the remnants of the concentration camps. Once people saw what it actually looks like.
Quite understandably. So
yes,
I know
absolutely.
your new book is, in some senses, autobiographical and historical, and you're writing not just about Nazi eugenics, but also euthanasia and the consequences of all this today. Explain why you've written this book, The Devil's Castle.
I wrote it. I actually came across the fact that Action T4, which was the Nazi action that killed several 100,000 people with neuropsychiatric disorders. I came across it in a footnote, and I just found that for a lot of reasons that are historically understandable, one being that when we tried Germans at Nuremberg, we decided we were going to try them for international crimes. Killing your own people was not an international crime. So the Nazi euthanasia project was really never litigated properly. It just has not had its moment historically. It's still largely unknown, even though there would certainly not have been a Holocaust if there hadn't been an Action T4 and a euthanasia program before the Holocaust. So it's tremendously important. I think we've forgotten it. And I also think we've forgotten how embedded we as the US were in that thinking. I mean, Hitler, even in Mein Kampf, he's looking to the US and saying, they're doing the right things. They have these wonderful laws allowing sterilization of the unworthy. We passed sterilization laws in 1907, so we got there long before Germany did in 1933. So to me, it's just a really important story. It's kind of a lost story because it's been so difficult for people to decide that this really was as wrong as the other Nazi deaths. And that troubles me.
Yeah, I'm sure it troubles many people, Susanne, although the way you're putting it, I'm sure will be heard in a controversial way. Are you suggesting that American ideas of eugenics led to what you call the euthanasia program, Action T4, and the rest of the Nazi crimes against humanity? Isn't that rather tendentious, shall we say?
Well, it doesn't lead 100% to it. Obviously, Hitler was discussing in the 1930s that he thought he could use the war to get rid of the mentally ill population in his country. So he was looking around, and I don't think we would ultimately have done what Germany did. So no, Germany's responsible.
To put it mildly, I mean, I don't think.
Yes, yes. But the idea for using gas chambers actually was first put forward in the United States by the Carnegie Institute in 1918. They did a list of 18 ways we could deal with this population that was considered hereditarily tainted. And one of them was death by gas. So we were certainly, lending a lot of conceptual stuff to this movement. We lent a lot of thinkers. I mean, American eugenicists went to Germany and taught and spoke, and Hitler actually corresponded with several American eugenicists. So we were part of it for sure, and I think need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, again, a controversial observation, Susanne. I mean, you could argue that science was, quote unquote, was part of it. I mean, just because people developed an idea of eugenics, it doesn't inevitably lead to the death camps, does it? Or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Well, the people who died in Action T4 died in gas chambers that were mostly built into asylums. They didn't go to the death camps for the most part. So no, it didn't inevitably lead to that. But I think that eugenic thinking is still so prevalent that I think we need to keep considering what it's led to in the past and what it can lead to now. I mean, we're not going to do something like that now, but we have gene editing tools. We have CRISPR. We can gene edit, unborn children. So we're still facing some of the same questions about what do we know about genetics? I mean, what are these kind of misinformations that are still floating around? I think it's important to keep pointing to those things.
In the Carmen book, Unbearable, she writes about how women of color in particular are treated differently from white women when it comes to pregnancy. I know that the American eugenics movement was very much rooted in race and in ideas about how white and black people were different. How, in terms of this connection between Nazi eugenics and the American branch of it, how central is race?
Race is completely central. In fact, you'll see Hitler even in his letters saying the Americans have everything right, but they're way too focused on Black Americans. So in Germany, psychiatrists were taught up until the war that Jews were much more likely to suffer from psychopathy. They're more likely to be schizophrenic. And in America, until I think probably the 60s and 70s, American psychiatrists were taught the same thing about Black Americans, that they were more likely to be schizophrenic. And one of the things I cover in the book was actually a movement that developed a lot of steam before it was stopped by a wonderful civil rights attorney to declare Black anger potentially a mental illness and treat it with electrodes. This was happening with the background of the race riots, and the Justice Department actually put some money into this research, wanting so much more convenient to think there's just something wrong with somebody's brain than that we are doing something wrong, we are harming people that we should be helping. So we're pretty parallel in that way, in that psychiatry has been a tool that has held people down, Black and brown people especially, for sure.
You're suggesting that what you call, at least in your subtitle, psychiatry's troubled history has an element of Nazi eugenics and euthanasia in it?
Well, it has elements of eugenics in it for sure. And we are following, our DSM, the book that we use to kind of guide psychiatric practice and the one that doctors have to use to get reimbursement from insurance companies. That was created by a group of doctors who actually called themselves neo-Kraepelinians after Emil Kraepelin, a German doctor who had really come up with the idea and emphasized the idea that any kind of mental distress was primarily just a disease of the brain and should be treated as a disease of the brain. So we are still very much embedded in German thinking. It's very different. And, I don't think psychiatry is evil. And I think most psychiatrists go into it wanting to help people. But I also think that that is an idea that hasn't worked out. Neurotransmitter theory has gotten a lot more people on meds, but not a whole lot of people feeling better. So I think that some of that thinking about brain processes, brain chemistry, does go back to Germany and is still prevalent here. It doesn't mean that we're practicing Nazi eugenics. I wouldn't say that, because obviously we're not. I mean, they deliberately killed people and they got the members of the profession to do it. I don't believe in any way that would happen here.
You also write a column in Psychology Today, Mad Woman Out of the Attic.
Yes.
Care Without the Idea of Disease. I've been reading some of your columns, very interesting and autobiographical. How autobiographical is this book, The Devil's Castle?
Well, I'm certainly going into it as somebody who was once diagnosed schizophrenic and told as a 15-year-old that, I should say my parents were told in front of me, because at that point I think I had the social status of a potted plant, but that I couldn't expect anything but a life of institutionalization. And then that diagnosis was changed to bipolar. And because we have these rigid categories, which we inherited from the German Kraepelin, it was kind of, well, hooray, there's hope for you. That's hopeful. The fact of the matter is that most schizophrenics can recover. Most people with bipolar disorder live good lives. I'm not sure that even these distinctions between disorders make a whole lot of sense. So yes, my personal story is a part of this. I'm writing this as someone who could have been a victim of what happened in Nazi Germany and who has family members that could have been victims. So it's very personal for me in that way, for sure.
I know you also focus on the stories of two Germans, Daniel Paul Schrader and Dorothea Buck. Tell me about Buck and Schrader and why they're such important characters in Devil's Castle and what they tell us.
Sure.
Going back to the subtitle of your book, how psychiatry's troubled history reverberates today.
Well, one of my favorite blurbs on the book calls it deeply optimistic, and it really is. And one of the things that makes me optimistic is going back to people who really have figured out better ways of doing things. Paul Schraber was a German judge who was hospitalized for life in the end of the 1800s. And he actually litigated his own release, and his legal papers are so brilliant. They changed German law. He was really just an astonishing thinker. And what's wonderful about the Schraber case is that he never said, I'm not crazy. He said, this is what it means to me to think the way I do. This is what goes on in my mind, and it's religious and it's spiritual and it's important to me. And the jury absolutely believed with him, agreed with him, and released him and kind of threw his thoughts in the face of his doctor, who was trying to hold on to him. So he was really important to me. Dorothea Buck was a German Nazi survivor. She was sterilized under the Nazi law to prevent hereditary diseases because she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. But she ended up becoming a psychiatric activist, really arguing against biological psychiatry, or strictly biological psychiatry, and protested till the end of her life, which was quite long. She died at 102. She was out there protesting well into her 90s because, for one thing, victims like her of Nazi Germany were never labeled victims of National Socialism by the Germans. So they did not get the reparations that other victims did. But secondly, she simply wanted psychiatry to change. She wanted it to be more humane. She wanted it to be holistic. And she worked with a guy I was lucky enough to get to meet, a psychotherapist, and created basically her own treatment modality she called Trialogue. And during her lifetime, there are hundreds of these seminars around Germany, and I think some of them were also in Switzerland. Very effective, very wonderful ways to help people. So she's one of my just guiding lights. And the reason that she didn't die in Action T4, she was hospitalized during that time, but the doctor, Karl Kleist, who ran the asylum where she was, just refused to participate. And that was pretty heartbreaking to see that doctors could do that. They could simply say no and go get along with their lives and not be punished. But unfortunately, that was true.
What were the numbers in the euthanasia program in Action T4 particularly?
Sure. Wonderful question. I've already said that because there was no kind of Nuremberg or Eichmann trial to cover these proceedings, we're still not 100% sure, but between 80 and 100,000 people died in Germany and Austria in the gas chambers that they built. Most of them, 5 out of 6, were in asylums. Then there was a period called wild euthanasia during the war when the official program shut down, but doctors were encouraged to simply do the killing on their own. And that killed maybe another 20,000. It's very hard to say. And there was a brief program where doctors were sent to camps and diagnosed people as mentally ill and had them killed in the camps on that grounds. But at that point, mental illness could be diagnosed by the word asocial. So basically, if you were doing something the government didn't want, they could kill you under those auspices. That probably killed another 10 or 20,000. So total, including the German territories where people were also being killed or allowed to starve, probably 300,000 total, I think.
We've done shows in the past on Auschwitz, and everybody, of course, now associates Auschwitz with industrial death camps. Mm-hmm. I hadn't known about Sonnenstein Castle, which still exists in Germany, which was mm-hmm. where the Action T4 was carried out. Did you visit it for the book?
I did. So Sonnenstein was one of 6 facilities that had gas chambers built into them. Another one was also a castle called Hartheim. Several were just pre-existing hospitals. Sonnenstein had been used as a hospital. They were just these sort of empty fortress spaces. One was an empty prison, or spaces that had been reassigned to become asylums, and they were also used as gas chambers. Some were doing both at the same time, housing patients and also determining patients that had to, that were, they were selected to die in the program while others were treated. So there were 6, and I've been to the one at Sonnenstein twice, yes.
What about the role? You've already talked about doctors. Scientists and medicine now is, of course, intensely politicized in the age of RFK Jr.
Sure.
What did you find about the moral and other responsibility of doctors in T4?
Well, that's a hard question and a great question, because you want to find monsters. And there were doctors who were just brutal, and people would say, oh, he was really brutal before this all started. But then there are others, like a doctor named Paul Nietzsche, who was a student of Emil Kraepelin, who I've mentioned, who was actually really idealistic. I mean, when he practiced for the benefit of his patients. He did things that were fairly advanced at the time. But at the same time, he was perfectly happy to step in and run this killing program. And in the last years of the war, he even wrote a letter to Hitler saying, please don't forget how important psychiatry is. We need to keep it going. We need to help people. And I think it was sincere. I think that there's a lot of danger to systems in which we pretend we can assign people absolute value whether it's based on what's in the DSM right now or what Emil Kraepelin was peddling in his day, or anything like that. We get into terrible trouble when we use a system that's designed to assign value and hope to people. And I think, unfortunately, psychiatry has tended to function that way. There's this idea that if you have certain diagnoses, there's no hope for you. And with others, it's, supposed to be a better outcome. But none of these are actually proven. These are largely myths. And I think that we've also gone so far in the direction of still thinking very genetically, more than I think there's actual proof that, that genes are as important as we think they are. So I think it's those two things together. I think it's that, the First World War and the Second World War really strained Germany's resources, and doctors were just being taught, this is somebody who's worth it, this is somebody who's not going to be worth it. And that I think we're still doing to some extent.
Yeah, of course, Hannah Arendt went to Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem and described him as banal. I don't suppose you would describe your doctors as banal. Is there a word you might choose? She also had the idea of radical evil. I'm guessing that you didn't find either radical evil or banality in your doctors in Sonnenstein.
You occasionally would find a doctor who, like I said, had, I think Christian Worth was one who had the nickname Savage Christian. He was known to be really brutal. Mengele was brutal, but some of them were nerds and banal. And it was in the middle of the Eichmann trial. Adolf Eichmann was captured by the Mossad and tried in Israel. So he had a very thorough trial for Nazi crimes. And in the middle of it, I think it was a journalist said that it was hard to believe that so many people had died at the hands of such a nerd. I mean,
and that's basically what Arendt said, and she got into trouble for it. Arendt, of course, created a great deal of controversy by describing Eichmann as banal and entitling her book, The Banality of Evil. There were those, particularly within the Jewish community, who wanted to see the Nazis or what they did to the Jews in particular, as a unique crime. You seem to be straying, Susanne, into Arendtian territory here in The Devil's Castle by linking Nazi eugenics and euthanasia with American 19th century science, that maybe this was a more universal crime than just one terrible, terrible episode in 20th century German history.
Well, I think the universal crime, again, is deciding that we know who's good and who's bad, and that we know what lives have value and hope and what lives don't have value and hope. And I just keep coming back to that because, I don't know how I feel about Arendt and her characterization of Eichmann, but there were a lot of people, people that you wouldn't expect. I think most people know Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood was a eugenicist, but there were plenty of people in the US and Britain for whom killing people for these reasons was not outrageous until they faced the fact of it having happened. There was a very popular British crime writer, Niall Marsh, who wrote a book in the 1930s. And many of her books have been, we still watch them. The BBC is always filming her mystery novels. But the killer was actually a eugenicist. And he was just killing people based on the psychiatric histories of their ancestors. And it was called the Nursing Home Murders. And I thought that was so funny because Inspector Allen, and he got a whole series on the BBC, he's a great character. That was her detective character, Inspector Roderick Allen. In the middle of the book says, well, any rational person believes in what he called rational breeding. Any rational person believes people's breeding should be controlled, but taking it to the level of death, that's a bridge too far. So you even see this in pop culture in the 30s and 20s, especially. You see newspapers in the US doing these reports on ideas about sterilizing 10% of the population. That was I think a Harry Laughlin idea. He was an American eugenicist, just kind of discussing these things. And we had these eugenics congresses. I think what happened in Germany would not have happened elsewhere the way it did. So I always want to bring some nuance into that. But certainly people were thinking conceptually. And in 1942, this is in my book, 2 American psychiatrists had a public debate. It was put in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the leading journal, about whether young, mentally handicapped, as they put it, children should be destroyed as children. So we were still talking about this in 1942. We knew what was going on in Germany, but we were still talking about it. So I think that,
well, I'm not sure everybody quite knew it was still not entirely clear what was happening in Germany in 1942 outside. Let me go back to the Carmone book, Unbearable. She's, of course, writing at a time when abortion now is becoming increasingly hard to get in the United States, a post-Roe world. Some people choose to get abortions having learned that perhaps their unborn child is disabled or will suffer in some way or other. Does The Devil's Castle touch on that? What's your take on that argument on abortion?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that quickly? I just want to make sure I get this exactly right.
Yeah, well, maybe you can interpret it as you want.
Sure.
There are people who, knowing that an unborn child is going to be disabled one way or the other, perhaps mentally or physically, choose to have an abortion. Now, that's not, I don't think that's a form of eugenics, or even, I guess some radical anti-abortion people might call abortion a form of euthanasia. But in terms of what you argue and observe and experience in The Devil's Castle, has it made you more or less ambivalent about abortion, which of course is an enormously controversial subject, always has been, and particularly in the America of the 2020s?
Absolutely. No, it hasn't made me ambivalent about abortion, but I do think that our public conversations are missing this part of it, because I belong to this amazing group, CASey, Cultural Autism Studies at Yale. So I spend quite a bit of time with adult autistics, and including several close friends. And again, I think the discourse about this just very different way of being, this very different sort of consciousness, is so relentlessly negative that I wonder if we're allowing people to make decisions that make any sense when it comes to things like prenatal checking for different conditions. And I do think that the next frontier is going to be gene editing. It's going to be CRISPR and gene editing, and possibly getting more granular about reasons, things to check for prenatally. I think it would be awfully sad if people said, oh no, I'm going to have a schizophrenic child, and that is a lifetime of misery, so I'm going to not have that child, because it really isn't a lifetime of misery. And even what our DSM says about schizophrenia is far more negative than the actual disorder. Many people have a schizophrenic episode, or like Dorothea Buck, she had 5. They were, some of them fairly long, but she was an important artist and an amazing activist and had an incredible life. So what scares me about that is not giving women that decision-making power, which I think is absolutely essential. What scares me about it is the discourse leading up to it, and how honest it is about things. And right now, the discourse around autism, what did RFK Jr. say? They won't write poetry and pay taxes. That's quite absurd.
I don't think it's the only absurd thing about him in particular.
Yes, I agree.
But what does it suggest then about, you talk about and this is literally a brave new world of CRISPR, where we can design our own children, presumably not just what they look like, but how they will feel. What did you learn in your book, The Devil's Castle, about this brave new world, about the warnings, and perhaps in a way even the opportunities. I mean, we have to face this, Susanne, for better or worse. This is the reality of the science of our CRISPR future. I mean, this isn't going away, and it's probably not going to be bad.
I agree with you, and I think that's why we need to have very nuanced conversations about all of these, different ways of being. I do cite three biomedical ethicists who have a debate about gene editing in my book, and they pretty much concluded that parents should be able to give children any traits they want and take away any traits they want, as long as they weren't, as they called it, harmful. But the problem is that we don't know what we're taking away, and that so many people, from Abraham Lincoln to Vincent van Gogh to Dorothea Buck to many of the people you interact with every day, whether you know it or not, are neurodiverse people whose minds might, if you've got them in a psychiatrist's chair and we're handing them those checklists they use, might not pass muster. So we can't make it go away, but we can certainly work on having more honest and more nuanced conversations about what it is we're talking about. Almost anybody, if they're caught at sort of the wrong time, can end up with a lifelong diagnosis. And I mean, a psychiatric diagnosis. And that's one of the things Alan Francis, who led the revision of the DSM-4, when the DSM-5 that we use now came out in 2013, he actually wrote a letter protesting it, saying they were out looking for things to pathologize. I think that's a real problem. And when you start then making decisions about good and bad genes, then it really becomes a problem. So I think it's really important to just keep pushing back on those conversations. Are these people, we go to a Casey meeting, are these people we really think shouldn't be here on this earth? They're some of the most passionate animal advocates, some of the most passionate people that I know.
We had a show, probably was 3 or 4 years ago, with an author who argued that neurodiversity was really the new frontier of civil rights, where America's had a chapter of civil rights when it comes to color, gender, sexuality. Now it's neurodiversity. Do you think that's an interesting observation? Is there any truth to that today's real civil rights debate is over neurodiversity, or should be?
Yes, I do agree with that. And I just want to cite somebody that I've gotten to know and I talk about a lot in the book, and that's the neuroscientist Anil Seth, who works out of England. He does this work with human perception, and it's complicated, and so I won't go into exactly how he sets up an experiment, but he looks at how people perceive. And it's something that I do too. I'm really fascinated by the many ways in which people think. So I know people who can't think in words. I know people who can only think in words. I know people who think by going to a filing cabinet and taking out cards mentally. It's really fascinating. And one of the things Seth says is that neurodiversity is going to offer us, and I think it's a better way to look at it, what other forms of diversity have in the past, which is the acknowledgement that we're all far more different than we think we are. He talks about everyone. He has this wonderful quote where he says, if you're out in public, look around, because each individual is their own beautiful universe in a certain way. And so we have tests that are designed to establish a normalcy that doesn't exist, which is why a lot of people I meet, sometimes through substance use, sometimes just through bad luck, who get into the system at the wrong time, find it very hard to get out of. So I do think that understanding the fact that consciousness is a pretty wondrous and amazing thing that we all contain, and that for all of us, it's a very different experience. I think just having that sense of wonder that neuroscience brings would bring so much to medicine, which has had, overall a very kind of flattening effect on the way we view the psyche.
Yeah, the more we talk, I think of the case of Alan Turing, who I was just after the war, was given electric shock treatment because of his homosexuality.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you talk about that in the book, but is this the kind of example that you're making about psychiatry's troubled history and the way in which maybe not British medicine or American medicine are Nazi, but they're certainly guilty of crimes against humanity because of their fundamental mistaken attitude about our psychiatric condition, for example, thinking that homosexuality was a kind of disease.
Absolutely. And at one point, a psychiatrist in the 1800s proposed a disease called drapetomania, which he said was the disease of being Black, but believing you should be free, because he thought that was not a normal thing for a Black enslaved person to think. So yes, we have this history of these, and and so much of what has been said in psychiatry about women has been so wildly off. We have this long history of mistakes, and we have a kind of present in which I think patients have very little voice. And I think giving them a voice is probably the most important thing we can do right now.
Yeah, I also think of the case of one of the Kennedy daughters, one of Joe Kennedy's daughters, who had a lobotomy because she was, shall we say, neurodiverse. And of course, that resulted in her, if not death, certainly ruining her life.
Yes, and she was also somewhat of a wild child. And I know her father lived in terror that she was going to get pregnant or do something that was going to mess up her brother's shot at the presidency. So that's a really classic example. And the women that I found who died in these institutions in Germany, most of them were abused women. I mean, they were in terrible marriages. So the other thing that we need to do is start looking at people holistically and situationally, and sort of get out of this thinking that we embraced in the late 70s and early 80s, that it's brain disease at the bottom of everything, and your life will work out if we just fix that neurotransmitter that's doing wrong. That
are there particular mainstream scientific heroes and villains? I mean, Freud, of course, comes to mind. I don't suppose you're particularly sympathetic to him.
I have a soft spot for Mr. Freud, Dr. Freud. Yes, there are so many. R.D. Laing was a really amazing a guy who questioned psychiatry in the 60s. I think he sort of fell in love with his own mystique, but I think he was a really important thinker. Thomas Szasz, so many people that I interview in the book were, to me, huge heroes, as was Dorothea Buck. What a strong, ferocious woman.
Yeah, and she died, of course. It wasn't that long ago. She died in 2019. Remarkable life. Finally, Susanne, very interesting conversation, very controversial on lots of fronts as well. Let's get to today. Psychiatrist's troubled history reverberates there. You've already brought up RFK Jr. That kind of conspiratorial way of thinking might be listening to some thinking, well, I just don't trust psychiatry. They're to blame for T4. It's their thinking that had resulted in the mass murder of children and disabled people and homosexuals, not just in Nazi Germany, but throughout the world in the 19th and 20th century. Are you arguing for or against science? I know that's a rather general question. I'm sure the answer will be neither. But how should we be digesting what you're suggesting in The Devil's Castle and an increasingly distrustful culture of anti-scientism in America, manifested by people like RFK Jr.?
Well, I'm very pro-science. If we were really pro-science, we would have gotten rid of the idea that serotonin causes depression a long time ago, because that's been scientifically clear that there isn't a one-to-one relationship there that anyone can make, and that's been clear for a long time. So I think part of the problem is that we fall in love with scientific theories and find them very hard to discard, when science needs to be pretty clear about that. So I love science. It's a huge part of my life. But the problem with psychiatry as a science is that it's not looking at neuroscience. And one of the things I suggest in my book is that those two fields need to come together, because they're awfully far apart right now. So I think, and I know so many psychiatrists who are really good people who want to operate differently. I think everybody is ready for this 10-minute diagnostic system to change. And I think the field is ready for that as well.
Important questions, very important questions. Ones without probably clear answers. Science, anti-science, eugenics, euthanasia, psychiatry, all important questions, both the past and the future. And Susanne Paola Antonetta's new book, The Devil's Castle. Congratulations, Susanna, on the new book, and best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Best of luck with this message. I think it's a very important